Hello, and welcome back to Speak English Daily.
Hi everyone, we are very happy to see you here today.
Hello everyone, I'm Anna, and I'm here with Mike. Today, we're going to learn the expression, in other words. It may look small, but it can make your English much clearer and easier to understand. Have you ever watched a movie, listened to a podcast, or talked with a native English speaker and heard someone say, in other words? If you have, you may have wondered why they said it. Today, we'll answer that question together.
Hi everyone, I'm excited about today's lesson because this expression is useful for beginners, intermediate learners, and even advanced English speakers. The wonderful thing about in other words is that it isn't difficult to learn, but it can make your conversations sound much more natural. Even better, it helps people understand you more easily.
Let's begin with the meaning. When someone says, in other words, they are going to explain the same idea again, but using different words. They are not changing the meaning. They are simply making the idea easier, clearer, or more understandable. Native speakers do this all the time because they want the listener to follow the conversation without feeling confused.
Think about it like this. Imagine you're talking to a friend. You say something, and then you suddenly think, maybe I can explain that better. Instead of starting over, you simply say, in other words, then give another explanation. It's like giving your listener a second chance to understand your message.
Here's our first example. Listen carefully. The movie was hilarious. In other words, it was very funny. The word hilarious may be new for some learners. After saying it, the speaker immediately explains it with easier words. The meaning stays the same.
Here's another one. I'm exhausted. In other words, I'm very tired. Again, nothing changes. The speaker simply replaces a harder word with an easier one. Now the listener understands immediately.
One more example. She lives nearby. In other words, she lives close to me. Nearby and close both describe a short distance. By adding in other words, the speaker makes everything clear.
Did you notice something? Native speakers don't use this expression because their English is poor. They use it because they want communication to be easy. Good communication isn't about using difficult vocabulary. It's about making sure the other person understands you.
That's an important idea to remember. Many English learners think they should always use big words to sound smart. Native speakers often do the opposite. If they think a word may confuse someone, they explain it differently. That makes them better communicators.
Let's learn a few vocabulary words from today's lesson. The first word is clear. If something is clear, it's easy to understand. Next is explain. When you explain something, you help another person understand it. Then we have repeat. To repeat means to say something again. Another useful word is meaning, which is the idea or message behind a word or sentence. We also have simple, which means easy or not complicated. And finally, easier, which means more simple than before.
Now it's time for a little practice. I'll say a sentence, and Mike will say it again using in other words. Listen to both versions. The weather is freezing.
In other words, it's very cold.
My homework was difficult.
In other words, it wasn't easy.
The baby is asleep.
In other words, the baby is sleeping.
Great job! Notice how Mike didn't change the meaning. He simply made each sentence easier to understand. That's the real purpose of in other words. Now let's move a little deeper. Sometimes our first sentence isn't wrong, but it may be harder for another person to understand. Native speakers often realize this while they're speaking. Instead of leaving the listener confused, they immediately make the sentence simpler. That's where, in other words, becomes very useful.
Imagine you're talking to a friend. You say, the restaurant was expensive. Maybe your friend is learning English and doesn't know the word expensive. You can help by saying, in other words, the food cost a lot of money. Now your friend understands both the meaning and a new vocabulary word.
Here's another example from school. A teacher says, this project is optional. In other words, you don't have to do it. The second sentence makes everything much easier for students who don't know the word optional.
At home, someone might say, your brother arrived late. In other words, he wasn't on time. Both sentences tell the same story, but the second one uses words that beginners often learn first.
Let's visit a shopping situation. A customer asks about a sofa, and the salesperson says, it's enormous. In other words, it's very big. Instead of stopping the conversation to explain one difficult word, the speaker naturally teaches the meaning while continuing to talk.
The same thing happens at work. A manager says, please reduce the cost. In other words, spend less money. The listener doesn't have to guess what reduce means because the explanation comes right away.
Let's review today's vocabulary for this lesson. Expensive means something costs a lot of money. Enormous means very big. Arrive means to get to a place. Cost is the amount of money you pay for something, and understand means to know the meaning of something.
Let's practice together one more time. Anna will say a more difficult word. Pause the podcast and try to explain it yourself using in other words. Then I'll give one possible answer.
Enormous.
In other words, very big.
Expensive.
In other words, it costs a lot of money.
Arrived late.
In other words, wasn't on time.
Wonderful. You don't need perfect English to use this expression. You only need to remember one simple idea. After you say something, ask yourself, can I explain this more simply? If the answer is yes, in other words, is the perfect phrase to use.
As you continue learning English, you'll notice native speakers using this expression in conversations, videos, podcasts, classrooms, and even business meetings. Once you start recognizing it, you'll understand why it's one of the most useful expressions for speaking clearly.
So far, we've learned that in other words can make your English easier to understand. Now, let's look at another very common reason native speakers use this expression. Sometimes the listener doesn't understand the first explanation. That happens in every language, and it's completely normal. When you notice that someone looks confused, you don't need to panic. You don't need to repeat the same sentence louder either. Instead, you can politely explain your idea in a different way.
That's a great point. Many English learners think they should just say the same words again. But if the listener didn't understand the first time, repeating the same sentence usually doesn't help. Native speakers often change their words instead. That's where in other words becomes very useful.
Imagine you're giving directions to someone who is visiting your city. You say, turn left at the intersection. The person looks unsure. Maybe they don't know the word intersection. So you smile and say, in other words, turn left where the two roads meet. You haven't changed the direction. You've simply explained it differently.
Let's hear how that sounds in a real conversation.
Excuse me, how do I get to the train station?
Go straight for 2 blocks, then turn left at the intersection.
Sorry, what do you mean by intersection?
In other words, turn left where the 2 roads meet.
Oh, now I understand. Thank you. Notice how natural that sounded. Nobody felt embarrassed. Nobody said, you should know this word. The speaker simply gave another explanation.
Here's another situation. You're helping someone use a machine. Press the button firmly.
Firmly?
In other words, push it a little harder.
That's much clearer. Again, the goal isn't to use more difficult English. The goal is to help the other person understand what you mean.
This also happens in school. A teacher might say, this homework is optional. Some students may recognize the word, while others may not.
The teacher can quickly add, in other words, you don't have to do it. That second sentence removes the confusion almost immediately.
Let's look at another everyday example while ordering food. I'd like my steak well done.
I'm sorry, could you explain?
In other words, I'd like it cooked all the way through.
Perfect. The second explanation helps the conversation continue smoothly.
Now imagine you're talking with a coworker.
Please follow the instructions on this page.
Which instructions?
In other words, read these steps and do them one by one.
That's much easier to follow.
Let's learn today's new vocabulary. The first word is confused. If you're confused, you don't understand something clearly. Next is direction. A direction tells someone how to get somewhere. Then we have intersection, the place where two or more roads meet. Another useful word is optional, which means you can choose to do something, but you don't have to. Finally, there's instruction. An instruction tells someone what they should do.
Here's a speaking tip that can improve your conversations right away. If someone looks confused, don't start speaking faster. Speaking quickly doesn't make your message clearer. In fact, it often makes things harder to understand. Slow down for a moment, think of a simpler way to say the same idea, and use in other words. Your listener will appreciate it.
That's one of the habits you'll notice in good teachers, friendly coworkers, and patient friends. They don't worry about repeating an idea. They care about making sure the other person understands. Clear communication is always more important than using impressive vocabulary.
Now, let's move on to another way native speakers use this expression. Sometimes nobody is confused at all. The speaker simply wants to describe the same idea with different words. English has many words that have similar meanings, and using in other words creates a smooth connection between them.
This is especially helpful when you're learning new vocabulary. You may hear a word for the first time, and then the speaker immediately explains it with more familiar words. That makes learning feel much easier because you learn the new word and understand it at the same time.
Here's our first example. She's generous. In other words, she likes helping people and sharing with others. The word generous tells us about someone's personality, but the second sentence paints a clearer picture. Instead of only remembering a definition, you understand how generous people behave.
Here's another one. He's careful. In other words, he thinks before he acts. A careful person doesn't rush into things. They pay attention and make thoughtful decisions. The second sentence helps us imagine that kind of person.
Let's try another example. The test was difficult. In other words, it wasn't easy. Sometimes the second sentence is very simple, but that's perfectly fine. Remember, the purpose is clarity.
Let's build a few more examples together. My neighbor is polite. In other words, she always speaks kindly to people.
The second sentence shows us what polite behavior looks like.
Here's one. Our new teacher is patient. In other words, she doesn't get angry when students need more time to learn. That's a wonderful quality for any teacher.
How about this? My friend is honest. In other words, he always tells the truth. A short explanation like this makes the meaning easy to remember.
Let's review today's vocabulary. Generous means willing to give or help others. Careful means thinking before acting and paying attention. Patient means staying calm while waiting or helping someone. Honest means telling the truth. Polite means showing good manners and treating people with respect.
Now it's your turn to practice. I'll say an adjective, and after a short pause, see if you can explain it using in other words.
Generous.
In other words, someone who likes helping people and sharing with others.
Careful.
In other words, someone who thinks before doing something.
Honest.
In other words, someone who tells the truth.
Patient.
In other words, someone who stays calm and doesn't become upset easily.
Polite.
In other words, someone who has good manners and speaks respectfully.
As you can see, learning vocabulary becomes much easier when you connect new words to simple explanations instead of trying to memorize long definitions.
And that's another reason native speakers love using in other words. It builds a bridge between new ideas and familiar language, making conversations feel smoother and much easier for everyone to follow.
We've already seen that in other words can help explain something more clearly and connect one idea to another. There's one more common way native speakers use this expression, and you'll hear it all the time in conversations, interviews, and even presentations. After talking for a while, people often want to bring everything together with one simple sentence. They summarize their main idea, and in other words, is a natural way to introduce that summary.
Think of it as giving the listener the most important message before you finish. You may talk about several details first, but then you want to say, here's the main point. Instead of starting a brand new sentence, you can simply say, in other words.
Let's hear how this sounds in everyday life. Mike, tell us about your weekend.
Last weekend, I cleaned my apartment, visited my parents, bought groceries, washed my car, and prepared my work for Monday. In other words, I had a very busy weekend.
That's a perfect example. Mike shared several activities first, and then he summarized everything with one short sentence.
Here's another story. Every morning I wake up early, stretch for a few minutes, go for a walk, and drink plenty of water before breakfast. In other words, I'm trying to build healthy habits.
Notice how the final sentence tells us the main idea. We don't have to remember every small detail. We understand the overall message.
Let me share one about learning English. I study every day, watch English videos, listen to podcasts, and practice speaking whenever I can. In other words, I spend a lot of time improving my English.
That's a sentence many of our listeners can probably relate to. The first part gives examples, and the last sentence summarizes the purpose.
Here's one about saving money. I bring lunch from home, wait for sales before shopping, and think carefully before buying expensive things. In other words, I'm trying to save more money.
And one more example about living a healthier life.
I stopped eating junk food and started walking every evening. In other words, I'm trying to live a healthier life.
These examples show an important pattern. Native speakers often give information first and save in other words at the end. That final sentence helps listeners remember the main message.
It's almost like reading the last line of a short story. After hearing the details, the listener gets one simple conclusion.
Let's learn a few new words vocabulary. The first is summarize. To summarize means to give the main idea in fewer words. Next is improve, which means to become better or make something better. Then we have healthy, which describes something that is good for your body or mind. Another useful word is habit, something you do regularly. Finally, there's goal, which is something you want to achieve in the future.
Here's a speaking tip you can start using today. Don't say in other words after every sentence. Save it for the moment when you've explained several ideas and want to give one clear conclusion. That makes the expression sound much more natural.
Let's practice together. Imagine you tell your friend, I read every night. I learn 5 new words every day, and I speak English with my classmates. What could your summary be?
You could say, in other words, I'm working hard to become more confident in English.
Here's another one. I ride my bicycle to work, I eat more vegetables, and I go to bed earlier.
In other words, I'm making healthier choices.
Very nice. The summary doesn't repeat every detail. It simply brings all the ideas together.
Now that you know 4 different ways to use in other words, let's spend some time talking about mistakes. Even though this expression is simple, learners sometimes use it in ways that don't sound natural.
The first mistake is using it too often. Because it's a useful expression, some learners put it into almost every sentence. Imagine someone saying, I like coffee. In other words, I like coffee in the morning. In other words, I drink it every day. In other words, that sounds repetitive and unnecessary.
Native speakers usually use the phrase only when it adds something helpful. If the listener already understands your message, you don't need to keep saying it.
The second mistake is using in other words when nothing needs explaining. Listen to this sentence. My favorite color is blue. In other words, my favorite color is blue. That doesn't help the listener because both sentences are identical.
If you're going to say in other words, make sure the second sentence gives a clearer explanation, simpler vocabulary, or a useful summary.
The third mistake is repeating the same sentence with only one tiny change. For example, I'm happy. In other words, I'm happy today. That isn't really explaining anything. Try adding new information instead.
Fortunately, English gives us several other expressions that have a similar purpose. You don't always have to use in other words. Changing your expressions makes your English sound more natural.
One alternative is that means. For example, the store is closed. That means we'll have to come back tomorrow.
Another useful expression is, what I mean is, imagine someone misunderstands you. You could say, what I mean is we should leave a little earlier.
You can also use basically. This is common when you're giving the main idea. Basically, the meeting was about next month's project.
Another simple option is so. After explaining several details, you might say, so we decided to stay home.
Here's another one. Let me explain. If someone looks confused, you can pause and say, let me explain, before giving another description.
And finally, there's to put it simply. That's a great choice when you want to make something easier to understand. For example, to put it simply, this machine saves time.
Let's compare some examples and decide whether they sound natural. The lesson was challenging. In other words, it wasn't easy.
Natural. The second sentence explains the first one more simply.
I have a dog. In other words, I have a dog.
Not natural. Nothing changed, so the phrase isn't needed.
She's generous. In other words, she enjoys helping people.
Natural. The second sentence explains the adjective.
I'm going home now. In other words, I'm going home now.
Not natural. You're simply repeating yourself.
Great. Let's finish with today's vocabulary. A mistake is something that isn't correct. Natural means something sounds normal to native speakers. Repeat means to say something again. Explain means to make something easier to understand. An alternative is another choice or another way of saying something.
If you remember one idea from today's lesson, let it be this. Use in other words because it helps your listener, not because you think every sentence needs it. When you explain more clearly, summarize your main point, or choose a simpler way to express an idea, the phrase sounds smooth, useful, and completely natural.
We've explored several different ways to use in other words, so let's finish today's episode with one relaxed conversation. As you listen, pay attention to how the phrase appears naturally. Sometimes it's used to explain something more simply, sometimes to clarify a misunderstanding, sometimes to describe the same idea in a different way, and sometimes to summarize a longer explanation. This is how you'll hear native speakers use it in everyday life.
Sounds good. Anna, do you have any plans for this weekend?
Yes, I do. On Saturday, I'm visiting my parents, helping my sister move into her new apartment, and then having dinner with my family. On Sunday, I'd like to relax, read a book, and maybe watch a movie. In other words, I'll spend time with the people I care about and enjoy a quieter day before the new week begins.
That sounds like a wonderful balance. My weekend is a little different. I'm planning to go hiking with a few friends, take lots of pictures, and try a small cafe that everyone has been talking about. In other words, I'm hoping to spend more time outdoors instead of sitting at home.
Hiking always sounds refreshing. By the way, did you say you're going to a trail?
Yes.
Oh, some of our listeners may not know that word. In other words, you're walking along a path through nature.
That's right. A trail is simply a path for walking or hiking. Thanks for explaining that.
That's exactly the kind of situation where this expression helps. One person says something, and another person makes it easier for everyone to understand.
Speaking of learning, how has your English study been going lately?
I've been reading short stories, listening to English podcasts while I cook, writing a few sentences every evening, and speaking with friends whenever I have the chance. In other words, I'm trying to practice a little every day instead of studying for many hours only once a week.
I like that approach because it's realistic. Small daily practice often becomes a strong habit.
I agree. Some learners believe they need to study for 3 or 4 hours every day, but that's not always possible. Even 15 or 20 minutes can make a difference if you stay consistent.
I recently told a friend that learning English is a journey, not a race. In other words, you don't have to become fluent overnight. You simply need to keep moving forward.
That's a great way to describe it. How have things been at work?
Pretty busy. We've started a new project, we're meeting with different teams, and we're learning some new software. In other words, there are plenty of new things to learn.
New software can be challenging at first.
It can. One of my coworkers told me, please update the shared document.
Someone who is learning English might not understand the phrase shared document.
That's true. I could explain by saying, in other words, it's the file that everyone on the team can use and edit.
That's much clearer. You didn't repeat the same words, you explained the idea differently. What about your family? Have you seen them recently?
Yes. Last weekend we all had lunch together. We talked for hours, laughed about old memories, and made plans for a family trip next year. In other words, it was one of those days that reminds you how important family time can be.
Those moments are special. Sometimes the simplest days become our favorite memories.
That's true. We don't always need something exciting to enjoy ourselves.
Speaking of enjoying ourselves, have you started any new hobbies recently?
I've been learning photography. I don't have an expensive camera yet, so I use my phone most of the time. I'm practicing how to take better pictures of nature, buildings, and people. In other words, I'm learning to notice small details that I didn't pay attention to before.
That sounds like a fun hobby. I enjoy cooking. Every week I try one new recipe from another country. Sometimes the meal is delicious, and sometimes it doesn't turn out the way I expected, but I always learn something.
That's part of the adventure.
Last week I made a spicy soup.
Spicy?
In other words, it had a lot of hot seasoning that made my mouth feel warm.
I enjoy spicy food, so I think I'd like that soup.
Maybe next time I'll make enough for both of us.
I'll be there.
Let's talk about travel for a moment. Is there anywhere you'd like to visit?
I'd love to visit a small town near the mountains. I'd enjoy walking through quiet streets, meeting local people, and trying traditional food. In other words, I'm looking for a peaceful vacation instead of a busy city holiday.
That sounds relaxing. I also think food is one of the best parts of traveling. Trying local dishes teaches you something about the culture.
I agree. Sometimes I don't know the names of the dishes on a menu.
That happens to everyone. If I asked a waiter, "What does this dish taste like?" they might say, "It's savory."
And if I didn't know the word savory, they could say, in other words, it's rich and flavorful, but not sweet.
That's another perfect example. A simple explanation helps the conversation continue naturally.
Looking back at today's episode, I think one idea connects everything we've talked about. Whether we're discussing family, work, hobbies, travel, or food, in other words, helps us make our message easier to understand.
That's why native speakers use it so often. They're not trying to sound smarter or use more difficult English. They're trying to communicate clearly so the listener can follow the conversation without getting lost.
The next time you watch a movie, listen to a podcast, or have a conversation in English, pay attention to this expression. Notice where it appears and ask yourself why the speaker used it. Was it to explain, clarify, describe the same idea differently, or summarize everything they had just said?
Then try using it yourself. You don't have to wait until your English is perfect. The next time you're talking with someone, use in other words once in a natural way. The more you practice it, the more comfortable it will feel.
You can even listen to this episode again and notice how the expression changes depending on the situation. Each example has a different purpose, and hearing those differences will help you use the phrase more confidently in your own conversations.
Thanks for spending your time with us today. We hope this lesson helps you speak more clearly and understand native speakers more easily. Keep practicing, keep enjoying your English journey, and we'll see you in the next episode of Speak English Daily.